All right, well, thank you again for joining us for the very first episode of our Wild at Work, a Stewardship series webinar. My name is Amanda Gobeli. I am a conservation education specialist with Texas Wildlife Association. And what I want to talk to you all about today is how monitoring informs management. Okay, so we'll be looking at some of the different activities that you can do to monitor species of interest on your property, and how the data you collect in those activities is going to help you make better management decisions for achieving your goals. So to start off, let's address some of the fundamental questions associated with monitoring, starting with the why, the what, and the where. And really, one of the first things you're probably wondering is why even bother with monitoring activities at all? Really, it makes sense to think about management as kind of a circular process where you start out identifying the main goals you have for your property, and then you create a plan for achieving those goals that's probably going to include some specific management activities. And then you're going to implement those activities on the property by actually doing those actions. And then after that, there is a step which is essential, but which is really easy to kind of gloss over or very tempting to just kind of ignore, and that is the monitoring step. And so we're going to convince you all why that is so important. Monitoring is going to allow you to track your species of interest over time. So you can simply learn what's going on with the population that you are trying to manage for, which of course is very important. It also is going to allow you to see the impacts of forces that are outside your control. So as you are tracking your species of interest, you can also be gathering data on things like annual rainfall, maybe annual temperatures. You can make note of what you might call like natural disasters or things like the hard freeze we had earlier this year. And all of those forces are things that you can't necessarily influence directly, but you can start to learn how they impact your species of interest. And when you can predict those impacts, then you can sometimes alter your management to help buffer your species of interest against those environmental conditions. It also helps you to gauge the effects of your management actions, to basically tell if the plan that you're implementing is actually working or not. Okay, and generally you're probably going to have kind of a general sense of whether your management is having the kind of impact that you're aiming for, but it really helps to have hard numbers to put on that, because that will help you identify some of the challenges that you're facing, which means that you will be more able to alter your plan and to better approach what you're trying to do with your property. It will also give you what you need to better appreciate your successes. So you may feel like you're seeing more songbirds or more quail, for example, but when you can actually compare numbers from year to year or across different locations, then you can be really confident in that feeling. And it helps you to identify lessons. Okay, you might form a plan that you think is going to be foolproof, and then you go out and actually do that plan on your property, and either it might work just the way that you wanted it to, or you might come away from that with some new experience and having learned something about your property that you didn't know before. So that's the why. Now let's talk about the what to monitor. And chances are you probably have some species in mind already that you think you really want to support with your management, and that's awesome. If you're not quite sure yet, then one type of species that is really, really good to focus on is what we call an indicator species. And these are going to be species whose presence or absence tends to reflect environmental conditions. So already you can probably think of a plant or animal that shows up on your property that's very abundant when conditions tend to be really good, and maybe that declines or even seems to disappear entirely when conditions are not so good. So chances are pretty good that that could potentially be an indicator species for you. Now, these are also species whose populations tend to fluctuate relatively quickly. So they change on kind of a short time scale. Oftentimes what that means is that they're species who have really high rates of reproduction and sometimes also really high rates of mortality. That is in fact the case with the northern bobwhite quail that is pictured here. What that means for you as a manager is that because their population responds quickly to environmental change, then you can kind of use that to indicate what you should do with your management and what actions you should take in response to that. They also tend to be very sensitive to habitat alterations, to things that are happening in their environment. And what that exactly means might change depending on the species. So it could be that they rely heavily on having specific types of cover in their environment, or maybe they are heavily reliant on a specific food source, or maybe they're very sensitive to high rates of predation. But in one way or another, they respond to that environmental change. Now, what this all amounts to is that these indicator species essentially function as a kind of canary in the coal mine. So when something happens in the environment and when something is less than ideal, you're going to see those changes reflected first in your indicator species, and that can kind of cue you in to potentially make management changes before those impacts then ripple out to other species that share that same habitat. Now, I already pictured the northern bobwhite on that previous slide, but there are all kinds of other species that can potentially be indicators. Just looking at the grassland environment, we also have other ground-dwelling birds, for example, like the lesser prairie chicken. Songbirds, like the loggerhead shrike, are also really good indicator species in general. When we consider aquatic habitats, then we've got indicators like the mussel and the chub that are pictured here. And in those environments, you do have some extra elements to worry about, specifically like the toxins or the nutrients that might be present in the water, with dissolved oxygen being an especially important factor in those environments. Amphibians, native amphibians specifically, like the Houston toad that's here, also tend to be really great indicators, partly because they are super sensitive to changes in their habitat, and also because they have the added bonus of living their life in two very different habitat types, with the first part of their life being entirely aquatic, and then the adult part of their life being kind of aquatic terrestrial hybrid situation. And then finally, our pollinators, like our native bee species, in addition to being really important ecologically, also tend to be really excellent indicators to pay attention to. All right, now, as we go through the rest of this presentation, you will know that I am looking at a lot of these questions that we're going to be asking ourselves through the lens of quail management. Okay, and there's a few different reasons why I'm doing that, so I just kind of want to explain that so that we're all on the same page here. The first reason why I'm looking at it through the eyes of a quail is that northern bobwhite quail specifically are both an indicator species, which we just talked about, and they're also a really great umbrella species. And what I mean by that is a species that tends to be very charismatic, very well loved, one that garners a lot of attention and resources that are devoted to its conservation and to creating habitat for it. So for quail, when effort is made to support quail habitat, then all the other species that share that habitat benefit as well. And oftentimes that includes animals that may be less charismatic, such as our insects and our reptiles and things like that. Bobwhites also are ecologically, culturally, and economically important, particularly in the state of Texas. They are really important prey species for a lot of different grassland predators. Culturally, a lot of people have like nostalgic feelings that are associated with seeing and hearing bobwhites, so they're much beloved by many folks around here. And they also happen to be a game bird, so they're economically important, in particular for rural counties in Texas. And then finally, we're looking at this through the eyes of bobwhites because there are several very well-established monitoring techniques for them that are available to anybody that you can find online. There's very specific procedures, so they make for a really great example. They also happen to be a species that I personally have some interest in and have a background in, so it's easier for me to think about it through quail. Now, having said that, a lot of the techniques that we're talking about have basically founding principles and ideas associated with them that can be applied to any species of interest that you might have. Now let's talk about where to monitor, because if you have a property of a few hundred or even a few thousand acres, then you're going to have to pick specific spots where you're going to do these monitoring exercises. The first thing to keep in mind is that you want to have coverage that is representative of your goals. Okay, so if you really only want to monitor or to manage for your target species in one part of your property, then you really only need to have monitoring exercises done in that part of the property. If instead you're wanting to just increase species diversity across your entire property, then you need to make sure that you're monitoring in all the different habitat types that may be present there. You want to choose spots that you can access relatively easily. And the reason for that is that you get the best data if you can go back to those same spots consistently year after year and collect in a reliable way. Okay, so in order to do that, you don't want to pick a spot that, maybe is prone to like getting flooded in wet years or anything like that. A lot of times people choose spots that are kind of just a little bit off of their ranch roads or things like that, so that they are in fact easily accessible. Once again, you do want to have consistency across years. So you basically have a long-lived data set that you can refer back to. And now possibly the hardest one to adhere to of all these tips is no cherry picking. You probably already have in mind certain spots on your property where your species of interest is going to be really abundant, and it's going to be really fun to monitor there because you're going to record some high numbers that will make you feel really good. Of course, do have some representative spots there to get those covered, but you also have to be honest once again with what your goals are, and you may need to also monitor in spots that aren't so ideal. All right, now let's start getting at some of the questions that you're going to try to answer with your monitoring activities. The first and the most obvious one being, how many animals are out there? So what we're kind of asking here is to approach some kind of census, essentially. We want to get a feel for how many members are in the population. These techniques that I'm covering here right now are mostly ones that are only options for researchers. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute, but these are also some of the things that I think probably immediately spring to mind when you're imagining how people count wildlife. So I did want to address them a little bit. So one method, it's kind of seems natural that if you wanted to count the number of animals, you would first need to capture or trap animals out on the landscape. So a lot of times what researchers will do is they will set out a trap. Sometimes it's like a metal box trap for like mammals, or for birds, they may set out a mist net. But one way or another, they capture those animals, they put some kind of mark on them. So like a leg band for birds, for example, or like an ear tag for mammals. And then they let them go and they continue that trapping effort. And then they can compare marked individuals in their traps, so previously caught, versus the number of unmarked individuals. And by doing some statistics and some math, they can then approach the overall size of the population. So a few things about this effort. It requires direct contact with the animal, which depending on what the animal is, can potentially have some risks associated with it. It is very time and energy intensive, which is one reason why you tend to see like graduate students or researchers doing this most often. And the most important point here, another reason why this is mostly only for researchers, is that anytime you are capturing, confining, and or transporting a native Texas species, there's a very high likelihood that there are specific permits that are required for that. So if you were ever even dreaming about doing anything like this, the first step would be to check with Texas Parks and Wildlife and see if there are permitting requirements. Oftentimes those permits are only awarded for research efforts. So definitely something you need to look into. Other options include things like aerial counts. Some species can be counted pretty effectively from a helicopter, for example, as well as drone surveys. Drones are becoming more impactful and influential in wildlife research. There are some exciting developments happening with those. I'm going to show you some pictures of those here in just a second. There's also laws surrounding flying drones that seem to be changing on a fairly rapid and regular basis. So that's another thing that you would want to check on before you do anything like that. All right, so speaking of drones, this is just an example of some of the emerging technology with these. This is just showing us kind of two versions of an aerial photograph here, looking down into this tree, which I believe is full of monkeys, is what we're looking at. And in just the regular full color image, you can't tell at all that there are any animals in that tree. But when we switch to infrared imagery, now each of those animals lights up bright yellow. So this is really cool because it has potential to allow researchers to get a pretty accurate count of the members of a population without having to directly handle and stress those animals out. So pretty exciting. All right, instead, what a lot of y'all will probably be doing rather than those other techniques is going to be something called an index of abundance. Okay, and an index of abundance is a relative measure of the size of a population. So basically, these techniques are not going to get you anywhere close to knowing the number of animals that are in that population, but it will give you a figure that you can compare across years and between different parts of your property. So one good example here that we use a lot for quail is something called a call count. You can also do these with other types of birds. Basically, you go out to your data collection point on your property and you listen for 5 minutes or so, and you record all the individuals that you hear calling during that 5-minute period. So again, you're not going to learn how many quail are out there total, but when you hear more or less quail in a given year, then you can use that to kind of estimate which direction the population is going. Similarly, roadside counts are one where you actually would like directly observe the animals, but you're only doing it while like driving along some stretch of ranch road. So for that one, you would basically end up with a figure of like birds seen per mile, for example. Tracks or droppings can also be really good, at least for indicating like presence or absence of an animal in an area. And then if you happen to be working with a game animal, then harvest data can offer some really unique information collecting opportunities. In particular, you can get a better idea of like juvenile versus adult individuals in the population. You can check for like evidence of disease and all kinds of things you can't normally see. So a lot of these techniques do not require direct observation. So it's kind of an advantage there. And now let's discuss what the management implications are of doing like an index of abundance as part of your monitoring. Once again, this allows you to compare relative population changes from year to year and across different parts of your property. It also allows you to compare those numbers to environmental conditions. So after you do this for several years, you can start to get a feel for how different amounts of rainfall might influence your population, or different temperatures or other conditions like that. And then it allows you to measure those impacts of your management actions. All right, another question you may want to answer with monitoring is, what threats does your target species face? Now, there are a lot of different types of threats that you might have in mind. Probably the most obvious of them is predators. Okay, so what is out there that is trying to make a meal out of your target species? You may also be concerned with parasites and disease, which kind of go hand in hand a little bit. These are things that every wild animal has to deal with to some extent, but they are both things that tend to become more problematic during times when animals are severely stressed. So stress basically decreases the efficacy of their immune system. And that means that like parasites, for example, that may not have had any impact before are now having very real and measurable survival impacts on those animals. And finally, there's invasive species. So I listed invasive species separate from predators because although there are a lot of invasives which directly predate native species, there's also all kinds of other ways that they can have negative impacts. They can compete with our native species for food or the resources. Sometimes they can introduce parasites and disease themselves. They can tear up the landscape. They can impact water quality. All of these are things that the wild pig pictured here does to native Texas species. So there's just a lot of different effects that those invasives can have. So how do we monitor for these threats? And in the case of predators and some invasive species, game cameras are a really great option for that monitoring effort. One reason being that there's a lot of simple game camera models that are relatively affordable. And like everything else, you can buy a really fancy, really expensive game camera with all the bells and whistles. But for most everybody's essential purposes, a $80 or $100 model will be more than enough. So that means you can probably get multiple of them and set them up at different locations throughout your property. Now, one thing to note is that game cameras are really good at monitoring for highly visible animals. So animals that are large enough to trigger that game camera tend to show up a lot on these kinds of things. But it's also important to keep in mind that animals that are less visible, things like rodents or snakes that stay very low to the ground or stay hidden in the grass, those things tend to show up a lot less frequently on game cameras. It's a very low intensity monitoring method. So once you actually get a hold of those cameras and you set them up and you just get them going, then it's basically like a passive form of data collection. You just return in a few days and you collect your SD card with your pictures, and then you have some awesome data about what predators or other threats are present in the area. Important to note that placement of these is key. You don't want to put your game camera anywhere where it's going to capture 1,000 pictures of waving grass in front of the camera lens, or anywhere where it's going to be blinded by the rising and setting sun. And then once again, just to kind of emphasize, these are somewhat biased. So again, they're not going to get a lot of those less visible animals, even though we know that like snakes and rodents are going to be present in the environment. They're just not going to get recorded by the camera more often than not. Also, things like raptors or corvids or other kind of birds of prey, those are only very infrequently going to get captured by game cameras. Now, in addition to the cameras, there's other tools you can use to monitor for threats. Many of them kind of go hand in hand with the tools we discussed for monitoring your species of interest. Scat and tracks, once again, can indicate presence or absence of predators in an area. Oftentimes, some kind of trapping effort is applied to predators. And in the case of game animals, you can also check out evidence of parasites or disease when you have those harvested animals in hand. The bobwhite quail that is pictured there in the lower left is basically demonstrating somebody checking for eyeworm parasites. That little white speck you see in the upper part of his eye is a parasitic worm. All right, what are the management implications of monitoring for threats? The first is that obviously this allows you to track the prevalence of threats over time. So you might see that certain species are maybe increasing over time, and you can connect to other data points to start to maybe speculate about why that might be. This also allows you to consider applying management pressure to reduce threats. But there's a couple of caveats that are really important to emphasize here. For any predator control effort, it is crucial to consider the differences between native and invasive predators. So for invasive species, things like the feral hog, the wild pig that we showed you before, those have none of the normal checks and balances that are present for other native species in the environment. So they don't generally have very high rates of predation. They may not have as many parasites or diseases to worry about. They're really good at making use of all different kinds of food sources. And as a result of that, their populations tend to go out of control. And since they're invasive, they're not supposed to be there in the first place. So any predator control effort that you could apply to an invasive species to completely get rid of that invasive, we would be all for. Like if you can eliminate an invasive, then we'll say that you're doing an awesome job. That's very different though versus native predators and native species. Okay, in general, those native species do have checks and balances that keep their populations from going out of control. Sometimes there are things that humans do in the environment that can change that, but for the most part, it holds true. And the other thing to keep in mind is that the native species are so entwined within the ecology of the environment. They have so many connections to other species that are very difficult to predict that sometimes removing a native predator can have unintended consequences. Like the predator that you think is targeting your species of interest may actually be doing more work to keep other predators in check. So just something to keep in mind. It can be very difficult to anticipate those effects. Instead, what we generally recommend is that you first look for habitat improvement opportunities, because with the right habitat resources, a lot of species are able to deal very effectively with their predators. Now, management implications for disease and parasites, those are much harder to address and control. And the first step there would be to seek some advice from a local expert on that specific disease or parasite that you feel you are dealing with. So that's probably going to be either a wildlife biologist or some other natural resource expert, or potentially like a veterinary expert. Right, another question that you may be asking yourself about your species is how effectively are they reproducing? Now, this is something that is, of course, very important to consider, because any species, if it's not reproducing effectively, then it's not going to be present on that landscape for very long. But there is a golden rule that is associated with any monitoring effort that is directed towards reproduction. And that is, do not let your attempts to monitor reproductive effort interfere with it. Because the fact is that breeding season for a lot of species is a very sensitive and very demanding time. Many of them are at greatly increased risk of predation while they are trying to breed. It requires enormous input of energy and time and effort. A lot of them are very stressed out. Probably some parents out there can relate. So with all those challenges, you don't want to add on to that by really aggressively trying to keep track of specific nests or anything like that. You want to let reproduction happen as unimpeded as possible. So generally, a better and overall easier way to kind of gauge reproductive effort is to instead look at the results of that reproductive effort. And one way to do that, specifically in a lot of bird species, is to compare juvenile versus adult individuals within the population. So when we talk about juvenile, what we're really saying is an animal that has not reached its adult form, specifically not reached sexual maturity. Okay, and in a lot of bird species, the juvenile members of the population have a distinct and different appearance. Okay, what we're looking at here is a male northern cardinal juvenile, a bird that we're all very familiar with, and he looks very distinct and very different from the adult form of the male northern cardinal, who is very vibrant and very bright red. Juveniles instead, in general, tend to be less vibrant. Many of them have kind of like a mottled or kind of a scruffy appearance. Sometimes their legs or their bills will be entirely different colors. And this juvenile male still looks very distinct also from the adult female. So even though the adult female is also less vibrant, has more brown coloration, she still has a very distinctive appearance from that kind of scruffy, mottled little juvenile male. Now, this doesn't hold true for all birds, unfortunately. Northern bobwhites are one bird where it's much more difficult to distinguish juveniles, and we'll kind of look at a picture of that here in just a minute. But for a lot of bird species, this does work. Another thing that you may also want to pay attention to for some species of interest is tracking males versus females. For bird species, that's usually not something that any management effort is directed towards influencing. But for white-tailed deer, for example, that can be an important aspect of management. Another way to gauge reproductive success or potential success is with something we call dummy nests. And dummy nests are specifically for gauging predation rates on ground nesting birds. Okay, so this is something we do specifically for quail, but any bird that nests on the ground could theoretically be evaluated this way. And what we do is we take 3 store-bought chicken eggs and we use those to simulate a full clutch of quail eggs. So that would normally be 10 to 12 very small eggs. And we take those chicken eggs and place them in what would be considered an acceptable nesting substrate for quail. Generally, that's going to be some kind of bunch grass, for example. Basically, we are trying to create as realistic of a quail nest as we possibly can. Because what we're going to do is set those dummy nests out. We'll leave them alone for about 2 weeks at a time, and then we will check back on them. And you can record the number of nests that remain intact. We say that those nests have survived, versus the number of nests that have been disturbed in some way by a predator. And we call those depredated nests. So keeping track of those numbers in your dummy nests can give you some idea of the kinds of nesting pressures that the actual birds may be facing. Another really useful thing to do when you're doing dummy nest monitoring exercises is learning how to interpret the signs of predation. Because the cool thing is that because we're using larger chicken eggs for these dummy nests, a lot of times the predators will actually leave fragments of those eggshells behind. And different predators will go after those eggshells in different ways. So there are some that will just completely crush those eggs into tiny little eggshell fragments, and they'll leave those behind. There are others that will tear that eggshell into big chunks, and they'll scatter those chunks and those fragments all around the nest bowl. There are some that will actually just cut a little slit down the middle of the egg, and they'll access the egg contents that way. So if you can learn to pair those different types of evidence with specific predators, then now you can make a much better and much more educated guess as to what the nest predator might actually have been. All right, let's talk about the management implications of monitoring reproduction. So as we stated on the juvenile to adult ratio, that is a reflection of reproductive success, okay? And ultimately what you want to see is more juveniles. The more juveniles you see in that population, the more reproductive success happened during that particular breeding season. So by keeping track of that ratio, you can potentially see if it seems like your target species is, maybe needing a little bit more help in their reproductive effort, and you can take management actions which would theoretically increase that reproductive success. Going along with that, this is the picture that I promised you, showing our juvenile northern bobwhite quail. Again, much more subtle here versus that juvenile cardinal. The way that we tell in bobwhites is by looking at this set of feathers near the top of their wing. Those are called the primary coverts, and we have that red arrow pointing to them here. And in the juvenile bird, if you really squint at this photo, you can just kind of see there are very faint white dots at the end of each of those feathers, and that is how we distinguish. In the adult birds, those feathers do not have those white dots, and they are solid brown. So again, very species specific thing. Some are much more obvious than others. We mentioned that male to female ratio also. That's more of a reflection of reproductive potential. And as I said, birds, that's not something that we really try to directly influence, but things like, white-tailed deer, the buck to doe ratio suddenly becomes a lot more important. So you just have to determine the reproductive needs for your particular species of interest and figure out whether that data is something you need or whether you're better served by just looking at juvenile to adults, for example. All right, that brings us to the last question that you might want to answer with your monitoring effort. I'd argue it's actually the most important question, which is, how well is the habitat meeting your species needs? Maybe we should back up a minute though and ask a more fundamental question still, which is, what is habitat? What is the definition of habitat? And we've come up with a pretty nice, concise way of defining habitat, which is that it is made up of 4 components. It is food, water, shelter, and space. So food, obviously, is going to be whatever your species is eating out there. For bobwhite quail, it's going to be seeds, insects, fruits, and leafy vegetation to some extent. Water is also kind of obvious. That's a given. All living things need water. But the question to ask is, what kind of water and how much does your target species require? Okay, because for a lot of larger animals, they definitely need a dedicated source of standing water available. You can't raise cattle without some dedicated source of water, for example. But with quail, at the other end of the spectrum, quail, of course, require water, but they're very water efficient. So they're really good at getting it out of the food they eat and out of the metabolic processes that happen within their own body. So quail don't even necessarily require a source of standing water to be available to them. Shelter is kind of a blanket term that covers all the different vegetation and habitat types that need to be present in the environment. So included in shelter, there may be specific cover types that are required for reproduction. Okay, like quail need specific cover for nesting and slightly different cover for actually raising their brood of chicks. Your species may also require specific cover for escaping their predators or escaping the elements. Okay, so all of those different cover types have to be available. And then space, the very last one, describes how those cover types and these other resources are distributed throughout the environment. So what that means is both having enough space to sustain that population and having all of these elements arranged in that space in such a way that it supports your species. Depending on how mobile your target species is, you may be able to have those elements more spread out, or they may have to be closer together. So how do we begin to gauge these habitat elements? we actually have kind of a formal procedure for doing this in something called a habitat evaluation. And for bobwhite quail specifically, but bobwhite and scaled quail actually, there is a formal like habitat evaluation procedure where you can actually go online and you can find a data sheet for this that will walk you step by step through the process. It'll explain how to assign numeric values to different habitat elements. And ultimately, you'll end up with a score for each of those habitat elements, as well as a final score at the very end, a single number that you'll calculate with some very simple math that will tell you whether your overall habitat quality is poor, fair, good, or excellent. Okay, so that definitely exists for quail. There's probably other species where you could find something similar to that. But even if there's no formal data sheet that you're able to find, you can apply these same thoughts, these same concepts, and evaluate habitat using your own knowledge of what the requirements are for your specific species. Which is why the very first step and the most important one is to understand those requirements and to look at the habitat through the eyes and from the perspective of the species that you are trying to manage for. Now for the evaluation, I just described that process for the bobwhite quail evaluation, where you go through all that math and you end up with that final score. And that's great. But the real utility of the evaluation is that it helps you to identify the weak links in your habitat. We call those limiting factors, because generally what you'll find is that there's going to be some single thing that appears to be what is most lacking in the habitat. And that is going to be the element that will be holding back your population. So because of that, it is the thing that should be targeted with your management efforts going forward. Like if you identify that maybe nesting cover is the limiting factor in your quail habitat, then it's not really going to do you a lot of good to put all of your resources into supplemental feeding, for example. And then finally, maybe the most important thing of all to remember is that regardless of what your score says or how the math works out on that habitat evaluation sheet, if any essential element is missing, it is not habitat. And I'll tell you, there are ways to do the math where, you know, it might be that almost every habitat element is really great, like it's almost perfect. But if there is no escape cover, or if there is no nesting habitat, then, you know, your target species isn't going to care what your habitat evaluation score is. It's just not going to be able to persist in that area over time. All right, this table here, I know there's kind of a lot of information, but here are the main takeaways from this. What we're seeing here is a list of grassland bird species. Okay, and it is indicating for us some of their preferences in terms of short, medium, and tall grassland vegetation, as well as how they feel about woody cover and woody vegetation. Some are kind of neutral about it, and some actively avoid stands of woody vegetation. So in looking at this, you can kind of start to see how if you decided to prioritize any single one of these species, then your management situation would look different from somebody who chooses to prioritize a different species. And if your priority instead was to just increase grassland bird diversity, then that situation would look very different still. So like in order to create diversity or to support any of these species, you have to take into account their specific preferences. All right, now let's talk a little bit about ways to shape habitat. And this honestly is something that we could easily spend an entire lecture on. This could be a whole workshop, but felt like we needed to just briefly touch on it here. Because now, you know, theoretically, we've maybe done a habitat evaluation, and the next logical question is, what do we do with that? How do we apply that to our management in the future? And shaping habitat ultimately comes down to introducing some form of disturbance in the environment. And that word disturbance can have kind of a negative connotation, but ultimately what it means is that you are shaking things up out there in the environment. And there's a few different types of ways to do that. You can do what's called a mechanical disturbance, which might be something like grubbing or roller chopping, or just physically going out there and disrupting the vegetation that is there, which allows other types of vegetation to then colonize and take hold of that area. Similarly, you can do chemical disturbance, often in the form of some applied herbicide or something similar. That's generally not something that is recommended as like a persistent long-term thing, but it definitely might be essential if you have a situation where maybe there's some kind of invasive plant that has dominated that area, or maybe there's just a ton of vegetation that really only responds to like chemical control methods. So that is something that has to be considered as well. Prescribed fire is a very powerful management tool, and it's something that grassland environments in particular are adapted to. So there are certain types of plants and vegetation out there that respond very well and very strongly to that. And then grazing pressure. Previously, grazing was taken care of by bison herds out there in the grasslands. Nowadays, most of that grazing comes from cattle. But in either case, that is, again, a really important form of disturbance, and one that is just kind of integrated already into grassland ecology. In some cases, reseeding may be a way to shape habitat in case the plants that should be there and that you're trying to get reestablished there are just not coming up out of the native seedbed. So that is something to consider as well. In other cases, some form of supplementation may be applied to shape habitat. For example, if you know that you need woody cover to support your species of interest, and if there is none out there, then that's something that can take a long time to get established. So sometimes people kind of supplement woody cover with something like brush piles, or like by half cutting taller trees to bring that woody cover closer to the ground. Also important to note that the timing of these activities is critical. Again, we want to follow that golden rule of not doing anything that is going to inhibit or interfere with breeding effort of our target species, but also doing any of these activities, like the exact same thing at different times of the year, can have significantly different impacts on the response that you see in the environment. And this diagram here just kind of helps to drive home the point of why disturbance is necessary. This shows us what some of the first plans are to colonize an area following some significant disturbance, so basically kind of setting things back to zero. And then it shows us the progression over time of plants that change throughout that vegetated community. So the very first things to show up are going to be your annual plants. So that's going to be mostly like forbs and wildflowers and things like that. Then if you give it more time, you'll start to see perennials show up. So those are going to be, of course, more deeply rooted kinds of plants, as well as bunch grasses, and also some very small shrubs. Let it go a little bit longer, and now you get some larger shrubs, some more woody vegetation that start to show up. And then eventually you will see softwood trees show up. And after a very long time without any kind of disturbance, you could get to like hardwood trees. So essentially, if you didn't have any disturbance on that landscape whatsoever, you could eventually be looking at a forested habitat. Forests are great types of habitat. They are home to a wide variety of really awesome wildlife species, but they are not the same thing as a grassland. So if like a grassland or a prairie is the kind of habitat you're trying to cultivate, disturbance is going to be an essential element of that. All right, management implications of habitat evaluation. Of course, this allows you to gauge your overall habitat health and to just kind of have a nice, concise reference to compare, once again, across different locations and over time. It helps you to hone in on the areas that are in need of improvement. We use that term limiting factor. So now you can identify the element of your habitat that should be the focus of your management efforts. A really great thing to note also is that all the other monitoring things we just talked about, many of those challenges can be addressed by improving the habitat. So really great habitat will give your target species more resources for reproduction. It'll give them more options for escaping their predators and dealing with those. It'll lower their stress, which can make them more resistant to parasites and disease. So this is usually the first thing to look at in terms of trying to help and support your target species population. And with that, that is all for my lecture portion of this. We have about 15 minutes left, during which we will take questions.